So if you're pretty new to Maya, you're probably going to be working with something like this. If you have a character, you're probably going to have a very simple eye with two pieces of a sphere that you might be using as an eyelid. A couple things to be aware of when it comes to shaders. By default, on every piece of material or geometry that's created, you'll have a pre-existing shader, and that is basically your default Lambert. Usually you do not want to use the default Lambert as your main shader. This is because if your scene file is moved around between different computers, the default Lambert is usually going to be different on every computer. It's going to be specific to that computer. Also, sometimes there are rendering errors because it is a default shader. You really aren't supposed to attach textures to it or change it, just like you're not really supposed to be animating the default camera because it is also, again, the default camera. Sometimes it's difficult for keyframes to transfer between scene files because of that, and errors do pop up. So usually you want to create a new shader, a new camera. So if you are going to if you actually are working with the Lambert, what you'll see happen is if you actually apply a texture, whether it's a file texture or one of these procedural textures to the surface, and that's another thing, there is a difference between your materials and your textures. So a ramp is a flat 2D texture. Material is actually just a procedural shader. It's a shader node that can house textures. Okay, so if you actually take your texture and just middle mouse click and drag it to any piece of geometry that's using the Lambert, it's automatically going to add that ramp or that texture to your default shader because you actually haven't created a brand new shader node to house it. Ideally, what you want to do is not do this. You never want to do that. If you have done that, if you double click on the Lambert, it'll bring it up in your attribute editor, and then you can go to color and you'll see that it has an incoming connection, which is usually indicated by the black arrow pointing into the square. If it doesn't have an incoming connection, you usually have a checker pattern indicated on its right side. But if you want to break that connection, you can simply right click on the word color and then choose break from the pull down. Now, if you actually want to apply a new shader to the eyeball and a separate one to the eyelids, simply select the eye, and then from your Hypershade window, which is available under Window, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, you simply go to the Create tab, and under the Create tab, you're going to have a list of pretty much all the different types of shaders and tools that you can use to actually control the way things look when you actually start applying shaders and bump maps and surface maps and displacement maps and normal maps and any other kind of map to your models. So what you want to do is you want to first go to where it says Maya, expand it so you can actually see everything, but as soon as you click on it, you should get a list of the various shader types. And so these are all procedural shaders. That's usually at the very top. Those are the surface shaders, okay? And so you need to create a new surface shader first. In order to do that, you simply click on the type of surface shader you want, depending on the look you want. If you want something that's not glossy, it's more or less flat, but it still picks up 3D nicely, you choose a Lambert. If you want something that's a little more reflective, a little more shiny, you can use a blend. Depending on the type of shininess you want, you can choose between the Fongs and also between the anisotropic shader. So what you can choose here for the eye, you can do like a Fong, which is usually good enough for an eye. Or what I like to do actually is I like to use a blend, just because you have a lot of control over the shader. Now, of course, if you choose a shader type like a blend or a Fong, you decide you want to change it later, but you already have incoming connections, you can simply go into the attribute editor under that shader and just choose a different type of shader. But for now, I'm going to work with a blend. So if I want to turn this into an eye, into a shader for the eye, then I can simply click on the checker box and create a new 2D texture, a ramp, if I want it to. And when I create the ramp, it can just come up. It'll usually look something like this, where it's all blending together. But if you want to isolate the colors, you can set the interpolation to none, and then you'll pretty much just get there'll be no sort of blending or transitional elements between the colors. It'll just be flat colors, and then you can define them. Now, usually the color is going to lay out on the surface based on the UVs applied to the surface. If you're just using a sphere, its UVs should already be perfect for the default layout of your ramp, so that when you actually apply it to, so when you actually connect it in to your blend, so again, select the blend, middle mouse click on your ramp and drag it to the color, and then you can middle mouse drag that blend to the eyeball. Then your iris and your pupil and everything should appear in the right location. Okay, now usually what it's going to do is it's actually going to place that iris and pupil relative to the top of your sphere, which is why when you create an eyeball, you rotate the sphere 90 degrees and freeze it there so that the top becomes the front of the eyeball. And then, of course, for the eyelid, you create yet another shader. And usually it's a good idea when you're creating your shaders, label them. And I tend to leave the type of shader as the first part of the name, and then I specify what it's for. So if it's for the eye, it's going to be blend eye. Same for the ramp. If it's a ramp and it's for the eye, leave it labeled ramp eye. Now for the eyelid, same thing. You want to create a brand new shader. If you already have a shader for the character's skin, you can use that shader for the eyelids if you want to. If you don't, besides going directly into the Hypershade, another way to create shaders is to right click and hold on the geometry and drag down to all the way near, almost near the bottom. You can tell it to assign favorite material, and then you can choose from favorite material, you can choose the type of shader you want to apply. So in this case, let's say you want to keep the skin pretty flat, no specularity at all. You can just choose a Lambert, and it'll automatically create it and apply it to the selected object, and it'll bring it up in your attribute editor. And then you can just change the color there. Just click on the color and specify whatever color you want the skin tone to be. Make sure that you adjust your saturation and the brightness value so you can actually define the color. Okay, so let's go for a more Simpsons yellow. Now with your shader, you can also go into diffuse and turn it all the way up so that it's not diffusing the color a little bit, so it actually is more of that yellow. And if you want to apply that same yellow to the bottom lid, simply right click on it, drag, and simply right click on it and drag down and choose under existing material. You can choose that Lambert that you just created. Now again, good idea to name them so that they're easy to keep track of and easy to find in those pull down lists. So I call this one Lambert skin. And so this is pretty much the basic way you create shaders and you create textures to apply to those shaders. Now, besides using these procedurals, which are basically part of Maya, to create shaders and texture patterns, you can also go to 2D textures and choose the file node. And then if you double click on your file node and bring that up in the attribute editor, you can actually browse and choose an external texture to actually bring in to apply to your surfaces. Okay, so those are the basics of creating and applying textures and shaders.